In the spring of 1917, Britain was winning battles and losing solvency. Every week, the Treasury wired requests across the Atlantic for millions of pounds it did not have. The war that began in August 1914 as a burst of patriotic certainty had become an industrial furnace, devouring shells, ships, and cash at a rate no 19th century empire had ever imagined. A single day on the Western Front could consume 1 million artillery rounds. Each round had to be forged, and increasingly the steel, the cordite, and the machine tools came from American factories that demanded payment in dollars, not promises. By early 1917, London was spending roughly £2 million every day, and much of that money simply did not exist inside British vaults. The gold reserves that had underwritten the pound for a century were draining fast, shipped westward in guarded convoys to settle accounts with New York bankers. Chancellor of the Exchequer Bonar Law warned the cabinet that the reserves might last only weeks. The empire that ruled a quarter of the globe, that policed oceans and printed the world's most trusted currency, was quietly approaching the edge of bankruptcy. What made the crisis intolerable was its dependence. Britain could not simply command more resources. It had to borrow them, and the lender was a foreign power not yet even in the war. Woodrow Wilson's America remained officially neutral until April 1917, and its financiers watched British creditworthiness like hawks. If confidence broke, the loans would stop, and without American shells, the front lines would starve. The men in Whitehall understood the arithmetic with cold clarity. Survival now had a price tag, and it was denominated in dollars they would spend decades repaying. Into this desperation walked strategy, dressed as necessity. Diplomats began asking a dangerous question. What could Britain offer, beyond gold it no longer possessed, to keep money and goodwill flowing? Promises were cheaper than bullion, and promises could be made about places far from London, places most ministers had never seen. One such place was a narrow strip of land on the eastern Mediterranean, called Palestine. But before promises could be made, someone first had to control the money. That someone sat in New York. The someone was J.P. Morgan and Company, the Wall Street house that had become, by 1917, the financial nerve center of Britain's war. In January 1915, the British government signed an agreement making Morgan its sole purchasing agent in the United States. It was an extraordinary arrangement. A private American bank now placed orders for British rifles, negotiated contracts for British explosives, and arranged the loans that paid for them. Through Morgan's offices flowed billions of dollars in purchases, and the bank earned a commission on nearly every transaction. The empire that once dictated terms to the world now took instruction from a partnership on Broad Street. The numbers climbed relentlessly. By 1916, Britain had raised the vast Anglo-French loan of $500 million through Morgan-led syndicates, the largest foreign bond issue in American history to that point. Fresh borrowing followed almost monthly, and by 1917, Britain's total war debt to the United States had swelled past $1 billion and kept rising. Every loan depended on American investors believing that Britain would win and would repay. Confidence was the true currency, and confidence could evaporate with a single battlefield defeat or a hostile headline. This is why London obsessed over American public opinion. The cabinet needed Wall Street's money, but it also needed the sympathy of the communities that shaped Washington's mood. Among these were American Jews, whose influence in banking and press was believed, rightly or wrongly, to matter enormously in wartime finance. Meanwhile, across the deserts of Arabia, Britain had already courted Arab leaders whose fighting men could tie down Ottoman armies. London was juggling creditors and allies at once, and each demanded reassurance. An empire held hostage to its own ledgers could not afford to alienate anyone with money, influence, or manpower. So the strategists in Whitehall reached for the one asset that cost no gold: territory in the collapsing Ottoman Empire, land they intended to seize but did not yet hold. They would pledge it, shape it, and trade upon it, and soon they would discover the fatal flaw in paying debts with promises. The same land could be sold to more than one buyer. The first buyer was Sharif Hussein bin Ali, the Emir of Mecca, guardian of Islam's holiest city, and a man with thousands of tribal fighters at his command. Between July 1915 and March 1916, Hussein exchanged a series of letters with Sir Henry McMahon, Britain's High Commissioner in Egypt. The correspondence, 10 letters in all, promised something breathtaking: British support for Arab independence across a vast swath of the Ottoman Empire if the Arabs rose in revolt against the Turks. In June 1916 they did. The Arab revolt erupted, and Hussein's forces, aided by a young officer named T.E. Lawrence, harassed Ottoman garrisons and railways from Mecca toward Damascus. The Arabs believed they were fighting for a nation of their own. But even as McMahon dangled independence before Hussein, other British hands were drawing very different maps. In secret negotiations through late 1915 and early 1916, diplomat Sir Mark Sykes and his French counterpart François-Georges Picot divided the same Ottoman lands between their two empires. The Sykes-Picot Agreement, finalized in May 1916, sliced Arab territory into British and French zones of control and influence. France would take Syria and Lebanon. Britain would hold Mesopotamia and a foothold in Palestine. The independence promised to Hussein was, in the same breath, being quietly parceled out to European powers. The vagueness was deliberate. McMahon's letters excluded certain districts with careful, ambiguous phrasing, leaving room for later denial. Palestine's status was left murky enough that Britain could claim it had never truly promised it to the Arabs at all. This calculated fog would poison Anglo-Arab relations for generations, and the Arabs would later call it betrayal. The contradictions multiplied. Britain now had two overlapping commitments over the same eastern Mediterranean soil, and its financial desperation demanded a third audience be satisfied. The same land that had been pledged to Arab nationalists and secretly divided with France was about to be promised once more, this time in a letter of 67 words that would echo for a century. The recipient would not be a king or a diplomat, but a leader of a scattered people who had waited 2,000 years for a home. On the 2nd of November 1917, Foreign Secretary Arthur James Balfour signed a letter addressed to Lord Walter Rothschild, a leader of the British Jewish community. It was astonishingly short, a single dense paragraph of 67 words in its operative sentence. Yet it declared that His Majesty's government viewed with favor the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people, and would use its best endeavors to facilitate that object. Never before had a great power committed itself so publicly to Zionism, the movement founded by Theodor Herzl 2 decades earlier to secure a Jewish homeland. The motives behind those words were layered and, in places, cynical. There was genuine sympathy. Several cabinet members, Balfour among them, felt a religious and moral pull toward restoring the Jewish people to the biblical land. There was strategy. Control of Palestine would guard the eastern approaches to the Suez Canal, Britain's lifeline to India, and there was calculation about money and morale. British officials believed, on shaky evidence, that world Jewry held sway over American finance and over the shaky new Russian government. Winning Jewish goodwill might, they hoped, keep American dollars flowing and keep Russia in the war after the revolutions of 1917. Chaim Weizmann, the Zionist chemist who had aided Britain's munitions effort, lobbied tirelessly and gave the movement a trusted face in London. The declaration was carefully worded to seem generous, while committing little. It spoke of a national home, not a state, and added a crucial qualifier. Nothing should prejudice the civil and religious rights of the existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine. But those communities were the overwhelming majority. In 1917, roughly 90% of Palestine's population was Arab. A promise had been made to a small minority over land inhabited mostly by others, and that land had already been pledged, in effect, to Arab nationalists and to France. 3 commitments now converged on one narrow strip of coast and hill country. What remained was to translate these paper promises into real borders on real ground, a task that would fall to men sketching lines across deserts they had never walked. The men with the pencils were Mark Sykes and François-Georges Picot, and the frontiers they imagined bore little relation to the peoples and terrains they crossed. Legend holds that Sykes described his plan by drawing a line from the letter E in acre to the last K in Kirkuk, a straight stroke across a map spread on a table in Whitehall. Whether or not the phrase is exact, it captures the spirit of the enterprise. Borders were being conceived by European officials in London and Paris, drawn over deserts, mountains, and rivers most of them had never seen, cutting through tribal lands, trade routes, and communities with ancient loyalties. After the Ottoman collapse and the armistice of 1918, these paper divisions hardened into policy. At the San Remo Conference in April 1920, the victorious Allies formalized the carve-up. The new League of Nations mandate system provided the legal costume. Rather than admitting outright annexation, the powers claimed to hold conquered territories in trust, guiding them toward eventual self-rule. In practice, it was empire by another name. France received the mandate for Syria and Lebanon. Britain received Mesopotamia, soon renamed Iraq, and crucially, Palestine. In July 1922, the League formally confirmed the British mandate for Palestine, and its text embedded the Balfour Declaration word for word into international law. Now, the contradiction was no longer a private embarrassment. It was Britain's binding legal obligation. London was charged with securing a Jewish national home while safeguarding the rights of an Arab majority who felt they had been promised independence. The mandate ordered Britain to honor two irreconcilable expectations on the same soil, with the credibility of the empire and the memory of its war debts hanging behind every clause. On paper, the lines looked orderly, clean strokes defining tidy territories. On the ground, they enclosed a volatile human reality: Muslims, Jews, and Christians, farmers and Bedouin, nationalists nursing grievances, and immigrants nursing dreams. Britain had acquired a land, a legal duty, and an impossible promise, all forged in the fires of financial desperation. Now it had to govern the result. The reckoning would begin almost immediately, as the first waves of settlers arrived and the first shots of protest rang out. In July 1922, the League of Nations formally handed Britain the mandate for Palestine. On paper, it was a sacred trust, a promise to guide the territory towards self-rule. In practice, it was a trap London had built for itself. The Balfour Declaration was written directly into the mandate's text, binding Britain to a Jewish national home, while pledging that nothing would prejudice the rights of the existing Arab majority. Two contradictory obligations: one small strip of land between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean. Immigration became the fault line. In 1919, the Jewish population stood near 60,000, roughly 10% of Palestine's inhabitants. By 1931, it had climbed past 175,000. After Hitler seized power in 1933, the numbers surged. In 1935 alone, more than 60,000 Jewish immigrants arrived, many fleeing Nazi Germany. Land purchases by Zionist organizations displaced Arab tenant farmers, and resentment hardened into violence. In August 1929, riots over access to the Western Wall in Jerusalem left 133 Jews and 116 Arabs dead. British soldiers found themselves policing a conflict their own promises had ignited. Then came the Arab Revolt. From 1936, a general strike spread into open rebellion against British rule and Jewish immigration. For 3 years, the countryside burned with ambushes, sabotage, and reprisals. Britain poured in tens of thousands of troops, demolished homes, and hanged rebels. By 1939, the revolt was crushed, but at a cost of thousands of Arab lives and any remaining trust in the empire. London scrambled for a way out. The Peel Commission of 1937 proposed the first partition plan, splitting the land into Jewish and Arab states. Both sides rejected it. Then, desperate to keep Arab support as another war loomed, Britain issued the White Paper of 1939, capping Jewish immigration at 75,000 over 5 years. It arrived at the worst possible moment, as European Jews sought escape from genocide. Britain had promised a homeland, then bolted the door. The empire had discovered the impossible arithmetic of governing two peoples, hopes, on the same soil. And as tanks rolled across Poland in September 1939, the Palestine problem would soon collide with a catastrophe that left Britain itself financially destroyed. The Second World War saved Britain and broke it. Victory in 1945 came at a price no ledger could survive. The nation that had once bankrolled the world now owed the world instead. External debt reached roughly £3.5 billion, much of it to the United States and the Dominions. The gold reserves were gone. The export trade lay shattered. For the second time in a generation, an American loan kept Britain alive. In 1946, Washington extended a line of credit worth $3.75 billion, negotiated by economist John Maynard Keynes in the final months of his life. The terms were harsh. Sterling would have to become convertible, opening Britain's weakened currency to a run that came almost immediately. The empire that had drawn lines across the Middle East could no longer afford the ink. In Palestine, the situation had turned unmanageable. Some 100,000 British troops were stationed there by 1947, a soldier for every 18 inhabitants, at a cost the treasury simply could not bear. Jewish underground groups waged an insurgency against British rule. In July 1946, the bombing of the King David Hotel in Jerusalem killed 91 people and demolished the wing housing British administrative headquarters. Ships crammed with Holocaust survivors, like the Exodus in 1947, were turned back by British forces, generating headlines that shamed London across the world. Caught between Arab fury and Zionist rebellion, spending money it did not have to hold a land it could not govern, Britain gave up. On February 14, 1947, the Attlee government announced it would refer the entire question to the United Nations. It was a confession of failure, dressed as diplomacy. The empire that had promised the same soil to two peoples now walked away from the wreckage. In November 1947, the newly formed UN took up the file. The financial IOU of 1917, the desperate war loans, the contradictory pledges, all now landed on the desks of delegates in New York. What they decided would set borders that endure to this day, and when the vote came, it would light a fuse that had been laid 30 years earlier. On November 29, 1947, the United Nations General Assembly voted on Resolution 181. The tally was 33 in favor, 13 against, 10 abstaining. Palestine would be partitioned into a Jewish state and an Arab state, with Jerusalem placed under international control. The map was a tangle of interlocking territories, drawn to reflect where each population lived, but impossible to defend and impossible to accept for both sides at once. Jewish leaders welcomed it. Arab leaders rejected it outright, refusing to sanction the division of land they considered wholly their own. Within hours, violence erupted. Through the winter and spring of 1948, a civil war raged between Jewish and Arab communities. Convoys were ambushed, villages emptied. In April 1948, the killings at Deir Yassin left over 100 Arab villagers dead and accelerated a mass exodus. By war's end, some 700,000 Palestinian Arabs had fled or been driven from their homes, an event they called the Nakba, the catastrophe. Britain, exhausted and broke, simply set a departure date and left. At midnight, on May 14, 1948, the mandate ended. That same day, David Ben-Gurion declared the independence of the State of Israel. Recognition from Washington came within 11 minutes. And the moment the last British troops withdrew, the armies of 5 Arab states, Egypt, Jordan, Syria, Iraq, and Lebanon, crossed into the former mandate. The first Arab-Israeli war had begun. When the fighting ended in 1949, armistice lines had replaced the UN's careful partition map. Israel now held more territory than the plan had allotted. Jordan seized the West Bank. Egypt held Gaza. No Arab state of Palestine ever came into being. The borders that emerged were not the product of negotiation or history, but of a war ignited the instant an empire ran out of money and walked away. The green lines of 1949 remain the reference points of conflict to this day. Every clash over Jerusalem, every dispute over refugees, every contested settlement traces back to this rupture. The financial crisis of 1917 had finally hardened into the front lines of a war that would never truly end. Trace the thread back and it never breaks. The headlines of today, the rockets over Gaza, the barricades in the West Bank, the fury over Jerusalem's holy sites, all lead backward through the decades to a single, desperate decision made in wartime London. In 1917, Britain was borrowing tens of millions of dollars a week from Wall Street. J.P. Morgan held the empire's finances in its ledgers. To keep America engaged and its allies loyal, Britain made promises it could not keep, on land it did not yet control, to peoples whose claims could not be reconciled. 67 words in the Balfour Declaration, a secret map drawn by Sykes-Picot, a pledge of independence to Sharif Hussein, all of it woven together by the raw arithmetic of survival. The mandate that followed was governed on borrowed money and abandoned when that money ran out. The partition of 1947 and the War of 1948 hardened the improvised borders of a bankrupt empire into permanent front lines. Consider the numbers that endure. Some 5 million Palestinian refugees and their descendants are registered with the United Nations today. Jerusalem remains claimed by two peoples and recognized by neither's rivals. The Green Line of 1949 still snakes across the maps that diplomats argue over in every peace conference. Wars in 1956, 1967, 1973, and countless smaller conflicts since, each fought over the ground first promised twice more than a century ago. Britain, meanwhile, only finished repaying its Second World War loan to the United States in 2006, the final installment sent nearly 6 decades after the guns fell silent. The financial debt was cleared. The human debt was not. The lines drawn to satisfy creditors and allies in a moment of national desperation became the borders that generations would bleed and die over. A promise made to balance a wartime ledger is now the world's most intractable conflict. This is the price of survival deferred, passed down through 100 years and paid, still, by those who never signed the loan. A war debt still divides the Middle East.